a hard topic, theology. So last week we began the series by defining theology pretty narrowly as God talk. It's not about what we do, it's about what we believe God is, God to be. And at some level, the relationship between theology and religion, where if theology is what we understand about God, then religion is based on our understanding about God, what our responsibility or our response should be. So we covered that last week. So today I actually want to do a very quick um, sampling of Jewish theology, beginning with the rabbis and then moving to one of the more, or yeah, probably the most famous medieval theologian, Maimonides. So here is Abraham Joshua Heschel without any facial hair whatsoever. You will see him with a goatee later on, but this is in his Berlin days. He got his PhD in Berlin after he left Warsaw. And although he cut off his payas and shaved his beard and probably changed his garb, um, his own hashkafa, his own world view or outlook, um, didn't really change so much, although his practice certainly did. So let us wait, let me do this. Slideshow from current slide. Okay, good. All right. So my wife Rebecca hates this word theography, but I find it to be helpful. Theography. Why does my wife hate it? Because it is a blend of Latin and Greek, and she is a purist. This is Schottness for her, so it's trafe. But theography, the way I am using the word, is the geography of God, where we go or how we find God. So this is a passage from a rabbinic text that is a commentary on Pirkei Avot. The claim that it makes, the midrash, is the study of Torah is more beloved before the omnipresent God, hamakom, right, which means place. So the translation here is omnipresent God. The study of Torah, Talmud Torah, is more beloved before God than sacrificial offerings. Why? For if or when a person studies Torah, he comes to have the knowledge of God. You come to know God's mind. So just, before we get any further, that is rabbinic theography. That now that the temple has been destroyed, which was where we used to go to have some sort of encounter or experience of the divine, since that address is gone, since rabbinic theography hasn't necessarily changed as a result of the destruction of the temple, the substitute, the place that you go, excuse me, in order to encounter God's presence is Torah. So let's just finish up this midrash because you'll see how the rabbis are using Torah. Now, the quote is from Proverbs, as it says, then you will understand the awe of the eternal and you will find the knowledge of God. I want everyone to just appreciate that when Proverbs says you'll find the knowledge of God, it doesn't mean God's knowledge the way the Midrash in Avot is understanding it. It means you'll know something that, you'll know that God exists, right? Knowledge of Shai can either be the knowledge that I exist as a rabbi in Oakens Park, or it can be the knowledge that I have, right? Or my mind, in other words. In the book of Proverbs, it's clear in context that you will understand the awe of the eternal, right? You'll have awe for God, and you will find the knowledge of God, meaning you'll know something about God's existence. But the way that the rabbinic midrash is working is that Talmud Torah brings you to understand, to have knowledge of God, to have knowledge of God's own knowledge. to have knowledge of God's mind. Okay. So in the rabbinic period, if the question is where do we go to find God, it's the Torah and the study of Torah. For Maimonides in the year 1170, right? This is in his Mishneh Torah. This is not in his Guide of the Perplexed, which is his philosophical work from 10 years later. But he begins the very beginning of his halachic code by saying, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there's a primary being who brought into being all existence. All the beings of the heavens, the earth, and what is between them came into existence only from the truth of God's being. Huh. Okay, so the way that we experience God or come into contact with God is through knowledge, according to Maimonides, and it's knowledge about that which is in the world. And the way to go about accessing knowledge of what exists in the world, Maimonides continues to explain, is through the study of nature. It's the study of nature. And if you're going to study something beyond nature, in terms of a text about nature, it's Aristotelian physics, right? It's kind of crazy. So let's just read the red. The nature of one's love depends on the nature of one's knowledge. Right? The nature of one's love of God depends on the nature of one's knowledge of God. A greater amount of knowledge arouses a greater love. To know God is to love God. Right? And how do we do that? You need to seclude yourself in a library and understand and conceive the wisdom and concepts which make his creator known to him. Right? What does that mean? Right? What is the commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might mean over here? When a person contemplates his great and wonderful acts and creations, obtaining from them a glimpse of his wisdom, which is beyond compare and infinite, he will promptly love and glorify God. So what this means, and I just want to really emphasize that this is not in his book of philosophy, this is in his book of halakhah. In the Middle Ages, according to Maimonides, studying physics is a mitzvah. Studying science is a mitzvah. It is the way to fulfill the commandment to love the Lord your God. Okay. So for the rabbis writing Midrash, you access God through Torah, for Maimonides in the 12th century and in the Middle Ages, and for the whole philosophical tradition, the way to access God is through nature and creation. Okay. Now we'll get to Heschel. So these are some of his dates. You can see the goatee. That's very important. The bottom photo is perhaps one of the more famous photos of Rabbi Heschel. He is one arm away from Reverend Martin Luther King. I think Ralph Abernathy is there in between him. This is a good time to say that a recent biography of Heschel's life by the Princeton historian Julian Zelizer is fantastic. It's called Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement. And he gives you, here is the book, right? And it's fewer than 300 pages, and it is a great introduction to the biography and the thinking of Abraham Joshua Heschel. Unbeknownst to me, Professor Zelizer's parents, father and grandfather, were both conservative rabbis. I did not know this. Okay. So one of the first things that Heschel wrote of a theological nature was poetry. And he wrote it in Yiddish. And it was published a few years ago in a bilingual anthology, Yiddish and English, called The Ineffable Name of God. Man, So ineffable is one of those words that Heschel uses quite a lot. It means that which cannot be expressed or said. And we are God's ineffable name, according to Heschel. So I just wanted to have one beautiful passage from Heschel's poetry to show you how God intoxicated Heschel was at a very early age. God follows me everywhere, spins a net of glances around me, shines upon my sightless back like a sun. Right? So this is somebody who very much feels God's presence in a direct way. And he is in Germany at the same time with Martin Buber. And so this is just to say that for Martin Buber, God is the in between different human beings, or a human being and another subject, as opposed to an object, a thou, um, as opposed to an it. And it's got a very different and more intimate feeling than anything that Martin Buber writes. Although Martin Buber didn't write poetry, as far as I know. And this very much fits into Heschel's biography as the child of a Hasidic rabbi, and the grandchild or grandson of a Hasidic rabbi, and the great grandson of a Hasidic rabbi. So Abraham Joshua Heschel of Opt was called the Opter Rav. Hasidic dynasty traces his roots back to Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev and the Baal Shem Tov on both sides of his family. But his dad died when Abraham Joshua Heschel was 9 years old. So he was raised by his mother and his sisters, educated by his uncle in Warsaw. And he was a child prodigy. He apparently knew all of the Talmud by the time he was 9. And yep, and then when it came time for his secular education, he went off to Berlin to pursue a degree in philosophy and religious existentialism. And he wrote his PhD dissertation in, actually, maybe we can see this. Yeah, his dissertation on the prophets, which became a book 30 years later. He completely revised it, but there was a copy of his dissertation in the library at Brandeis when I was a graduate student there, and I pulled it off the shelves, and you open it up, and the first thing you see is a swastika, because after the Nazis came to power in 33, they had to approve all dissertations. And so it was quite chilling to open up my teacher's dissertation and to see a swastika in it. Abraham Joshua Heschel had a handful of people who identify themselves as his student, one of whom is Arthur Green, who we will be learning about next week. And Arthur Green was my PhD advisor. So I think of myself as Abraham Joshua Heschel's spiritual or intellectual grandson. Okay. Okay. So who was, or what was, the conflict that Heschel was writing in order to overcome? So with Kaplan, right, the idols that Kaplan smashed were sinister scientism on the one hand, the idea that science can explain everything there is in reality, and supernaturalism on the other side, the idea that God is this big Superman-like creature who can intervene in the laws of nature. Those were Kaplan's idols. Heschel shares some of that, but what I put in red here is really what Heschel focuses on. So resistance to revelation in our time came from two diametrically opposed conceptions of man. One maintained that man was too great to be in need of divine guidance. We know what we're doing. We can send somebody to the moon. We are in control of our destinies. That kind of hubris is part of what Heschel wants to undermine. And then the other conception, which I think really goes to something that Kaplan also emphasized, was maintaining that man was too small to be worthy of divine guidance. So the first conception comes from social science, the second from natural science. Okay. In our technological age, all right, this is a continuation of what Heschel believes is the greatest obstacle to having a relationship with God or faith in God. In our technological age, man could not conceive of this world as anything but material for his own fulfillment. We consider ourselves the sovereign of our destinies, capable of organizing the breeding of races, right? Eugenics, of adapting a philosophy to his transient needs, and creating a religion at will, like Reformed Judaism. He postulated the existence of a power that would serve as a guarantee for his self-fulfillment. That's specifically a swipe at Mordecai Kaplan. As if God were a henchman to cater to man's aspirations and help him draw the utmost out of life, right? Heschel doesn't see God as being at our service. God isn't a human function for Heschel. God is a living presence that makes a demand, and we'll see that as we go on. So Heschel says explicitly what stands in the way of accepting revelation is our refusal to accept its authority. Ain't nobody going to tell me what to do. I am a sovereign self, to use the language of Steve Cohen and Arnold Eisen. I don't accept, right? I'm an American. I believe in rugged individualism. Nobody is going to tell me what to do. I am in control of my fate and my life and my actions. So that's what Heschel believed he had to navigate around or undermine in order to help people experience something other than their ego. So this is really where Heschel wants to begin the conversation about God. And he wants to begin the conversation about God with the concept of human beings, because that's the only thing we can really know. We have our own experiences and we're trapped within our own minds in describing our experiences. And that is the temper of contemporary philosophy that has accepted Kant's claim that we can't really have any knowledge about anything outside of our consciousness. The only thing we can have an idea of is the idea of what is in our consciousness. Okay. So you're going to see that explicitly here, right, in this line. But I want to go through each of these and talk about a couple of them. So all modern Jewish theology is in some sense a reaction to Immanuel Kant from the 18th century in Germany. And Kant's claim is that we are stuck in our heads. And so we can't describe with any degree of confidence that which is outside of our own consciousness. But that leads us to describe our consciousness. Okay. So, in this process of trying to establish the reality of God for the individual, he goes through a couple of different levels. The sublime is that which we see and are unable to convey. It's the silent illusion of things to a meaning greater than themselves. So there's something else going on beyond what we can articulate through our vision. What is it? There's a preconceptual faculty. Kant talks about a conceptual faculty, but Heschel wants to bring it back to a preconceptual faculty that senses the glory, that senses the presence of the divine, that is ineffable. We can't describe it. We can't say anything about it. And this idea comes from the mysticism and the Kabbalah that informs Hasidism, right? There is something in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah called Ein Sof, infiniteness, infinity, endlessness, about which we can say nothing except we have an intimation that there is something beyond that, there is something divine beyond which we can articulate. And so what Heschel does and what Art Green says is that Heschel recasts Hasidism for modern people using contemporary language and trying to transcend the inside baseball language of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism in order to allow Americans, Jewish and Gentile, to understand the claims of Jewish mysticism and Hasidism without relying on this foreign vocabulary, right? Just to impress people, Heschel knew Yiddish and Polish and Hebrew and German, and English was the last language that he knew, and he wrote in all of those languages. Okay. Faced with the mind-surpassing grandeur of the universe, we cannot but admit that there is meaning which is greater than man, right? There's something bigger than us going on. The surest way to suppress our ability to understand the meaning of God and the importance of worship is to take things for granted. This is one of his famous lines now. Indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root of sin. So once we go unconscious about the wonder of the world, then that becomes the foundation for us to no longer behave in the world in a way that recognizes God's presence. And if we're behaving in a way that doesn't recognize God's presence in the world, then that claim that God should have on our behavior is gone, and that is the root of all sin. Heschel says that the intuition of God is universal. Now, this, of course, is impossible to verify. One of the things that I say when I write about Heschel is that I have no doubt that Heschel uses the language of suing, that God has sued human beings for their attention and for their loyalty. I have no doubt that Heschel was sued, but I don't know that everyone was named as a party to the suit, right? There are people who talk about not having the God gene, right? They just don't have a spiritual, they say, this is their language. I don't have a spiritual bone in my body. I believe them, right? I have no reason not to believe them. But Heschel at least claims that they are in denial about something that is universal in our minds that allows a preconceptual faculty to sense the divine glory. Wonder or radical amazement is the chief characteristic of the religious person's attitude toward history and nature. Awe enables us to perceive in the world intimations of the divine. So God is not transparent in the world, but traces of God's presence can be discerned. The next two pieces then round out his roadmap to theology. Awe precedes faith, and it is at the root of faith. When we lose our awe of the miraculous nature of reality, then we are undermining our own ability to have faith that God is the author of creation. And it is only through that faith that God is the author of creation that we can anchor our faithfulness to that claim. And our faithfulness to that claim then requires a certain response and a recognition that God has a claim on our behavior. That was a lot, right? And it's hard to get it. But I think this last paragraph here hopefully will sum it up. Faith is not a deduction. It's not a decision that we make. For Kaplan, faith is more of a decision, right? That's impervious to proof. But for Heschel, right? For Kaplan, Kaplan says this too, but he doesn't emphasize it. Faith is not a deduction, but it's an intuition. It's not a form of knowledge of being convinced without proof, but it's the attitude of mind toward ideas whose scope is wider than its own capacity to grasp. There's a recognition that there's more out there, that there's a divine remainder to reality, right? That there's a margin of divinity that we cannot access. Okay. And now, this is actually in a biography that Heschel writes on Maimonides, but this seems to be a moment of autobiographical candor when when Heschel describes what it's like to feel the penetration of the divine glance. And he believes that this is universal. So this is where I disagree with Heschel, but this is almost required of him to make the kinds of arguments as a religious existentialist that he makes. So this is particularly poetic, and this is Heschel's poetic description of his own revelation. A moment comes like a thunderbolt out of nowhere, in which a flash of the undisclosed rends our dark apathy asunder. It's full of overpowering brilliance, like a point in which all moments of life are focused, or a thought which outweighs all thoughts ever conceived of. There is so much light in our cage, in our world. It is as if we were, it is as if it were suspended from a star. Apathy turns to splendor unawares. The ineffable has shuttered itself into the soul. It has entered our consciousness like a ray of light passing into a lake. Refraction of that penetrating ray brings about a turning in our mind. We are penetrated by God's insight. We cannot think anymore as if God were there and we are here. That God is transcendent and beyond us. God is both there and here. God is not a being, but being in, meaning immanent, and beyond, meaning transcendent, all things. This comes right out of Jewish mysticism, and it seems like his own personal experience. And this is his claim: there is no person who is not shaken for an instant by the eternal. So being penetrated by God's insight could be a description of several of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible's prophetic experience. And I think it helps us understand why Heschel was always drawn to the prophets and to their conclusion as a result of their being penetrated by God's insight, that what God wants from us is not the ritual of animal sacrifices, but the righteousness and the compassion for God's creatures in the community. Okay. Um, and this, again, this is his claim. It's his claim, and I think it's true. This part I actually think is true. The immediate certainty that we attain in moments of insight doesn't retain its intensity after the moment is gone. Such experiences or events or inspirations are rare. To some people, they're like shooting stars, passing and unremembered. In others, they kindle a light that's never quenched. The remembrance of that experience and the loyalty to the response of that moment are the forces that sustain our faith. In this sense, faith is faithfulness, loyalty to an event, loyalty to our response. In the Zohar, it says that forgetfulness is from the Sitra Achra, is from the evil side. When we forget those moments of divine penetration, then we don't just lose our faith, but we lose our ability to remain faithful to that moment. Let's just jump to the bottom here. Unless the awareness of the ineffable mystery of existence becomes a permanent state of mind, all that remains is a commitment without faith. To strengthen our alertness, to refine our appreciation of the mystery, is the meaning of worship and observance. That's worth dwelling on for a moment. That what the meaning of prayer, worship, and observance of the mitzvot is to strengthen our God consciousness. I only want to say that my experience with a prayer book in a synagogue does nothing to strengthen my alertness of God consciousness or my appreciation of the divine mystery. I think here that Heschel is talking about worship not in the conventional sense of synagogue prayer or ritualized prayer, but in a different kind of worship that in the world of Hasidism is called avodah begashmiut, worship through the material world. So he is talking about worship, but not prayer. He's talking about what we do as a result of being flesh and blood to that which is flesh and blood. So Hasidism developed this idea of avodah begashmiut, of this kind of worship through materiality, that is very easy to track on to the Reform movement's emphasis on tikkun olam, that the more, and Heschel's own commitment to social justice causes, as we saw with Martin Luther King, as we see in his objection and resistance to the Vietnam War, that was not widely adopted by the religious communities that Heschel was most comfortable within, namely traditional conservative Judaism, traditional Judaism, and Orthodox Judaism. So one of the ironies of Heschel is that his theology led him to a religious practice of social justice that was not in keeping with the way in which his own religious communities engaged in social justice. Okay. So when he talks about God not being a being, then that opens up the question, okay, if God is not a being, why do we pray? And this is how he answers that question. Again, I don't think he's talking about prayer in a synagogue, but maybe some of you have a different experience. To pray is to take notice of the wonder, to regain a sense of the mystery that animates all beings in all attainments. Prayer is our humble answer to the inconceivable surprise of living. And then he just wants to make this clear, right? He lost his mother and his sisters in the Shoah. Prayer never entwines directly with the chain of physical cause and effect. The spiritual does not interfere with the natural order of things. Don't blame God for the Holocaust, right? The spiritual does not interfere with the natural order of things. So this is not just God's eternal question of man, Ayeka, where art thou? It's God's first question of man, which therefore makes it eternal. This is what God asks Adam in the Garden of Eden. Ayeka, where are you? And so part of what we really see with both Kaplan, but more so with Heschel, I think, is that the Torah is literature. The Torah is religious literature. And just as God is asking Adam, where are you? It's not a geographic question. It's not a real, it's not a literal question. It's a literary question, right? It's a psychological question. Where are you? And what Heschel then says, and this we also saw with Kaplan, the soul is endowed with a sense of indebtedness. We have an intuition that there is a claim made on us from something that is bigger or beyond us. Religion begins with the certainty that something is asked of us, that there are ends which are in need of us. And this then becomes the title of Heschel's magnum opus, God in Search of Man. Why is God in search of man? Because man is needed. Man is a need of God. Again, 100% consistent with Jewish mysticism, with Kabbalah, and with Hasidism, as well as the prophets, right? Going all the way back to the prophets. Okay. It's the awareness of God's interest in human beings, the awareness of a covenant of responsibility that lies on God as well as us. Our task, and this is the task of halakhah, is to concur with his interest, to carry out God's vision of our task. God is in need of man for the attainment of God's ends. And religion, as Jewish tradition understands it, the halachic tradition, is a way of serving those ends through concrete actions, what Heschel calls taking a leap of action rather than a leap of faith. But you only take that leap of action if you have an awareness of God's interest in our actions. Otherwise, hedonism is looking awfully good, as is a bacon double cheeseburger, as is fill in the blank. Okay, I'm checking the time. We're doing great. Okay. So two things. Hans Jonas, who is another theologian, far less known in the American Jewish world, but far better known, it turns out, in Germany, and maybe in Israel too, I'm not sure, would say that God's need is a necessary function of God's relinquishing control through the process of creation. Heschel doesn't say that. For Heschel, God is still omnipotent, but God chooses to restrain God's omnipotence. Heschel, twice in God in Search of Man, uses the term restrained omnipotence in order to emphasize that God's need is a self-imposed need. It is not external. And our relationship to God is not one of waiting around for God to bring Mashiach, right? Not one of passive reliance on God's omnipotence, but of active assistance. So in that same passage, that same rabbinic passage that we started with, Avot Rabbi Natan, there's this gorgeous passage that I love to quote, that if you're planting a tree, if you're planting a sapling, and somebody runs and is all out of breath and says, oh my God, the Messiah has come, come quick. who is it? Rabban Yochanan. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, finish planting the sapling and then go greet the Messiah, right? Finish your work in this world before you turn your attention to redemption, okay? And so that is how Heschel very much understands our role in this world, that we need to actively assist God in God's purposes in this world. I mentioned the biography by Julian Zelizer. I didn't mention yet this fantastic book by Shai Held. This is not a biography, it's a personal biography, it's an intellectual biography. And it's very, very good. And so I wanted to quote from Shai Held. Shai Held is the president of Hadar. Maybe you've worked with Hadar in the past. I don't know if CSB has worked with Hadar or had Shai Held or Ethan Tucker on the program, but wonderful scholars. So this is where the bridge is between theology and religion. God's self-limitation, right? In self-limitation, you can hear the language of tzimtzum, right? God's contraction, God's self-limitation. So again, what Heschel is doing is casting a mystical or Hasidic idiom into English. So God's self-limitation or restrained omnipotence means that God is vulnerable to the decisions human beings make. So much so that God's immanence, God's presence in this world, depends on our self-transcendence, on us doing things that are beyond our own selfish needs. Human beings have the terrifying power to drive God into exile. Going to say that again, that's straight out of Lurianic Kabbalah. Human beings have the terrifying power to drive God into exile. It's not that God exiles us, it's that we exile God. And once we have exiled God, we no longer have God's presence to protect us. And we are increasingly vulnerable to being exiled by other forces. Human beings have the terrifying power to drive God into exile and to cause God to hide his face, another biblical idiom. But we also have the awesome potential to solicit and enable God's return. How? Through mitzvot. Since a mitzvah, as we have seen, is a prayer in the form of a deed, a prayer in the form of deed, right? That's a Hasidic, that's Heschel's translation of avodah shebegashmiut, of worship through corporeality. Since a mitzvah, as we have seen, is a prayer in the form of a deed, all acts of worship are at bottom attempts to reestablish divine immanence. Love that. Love that. Okay. On the left, we have Heschel's quote, which is from a 1945 article that he wrote on Jewish mysticism. The belief in the greatness of human beings, in the metaphysical effectiveness of our acts, of our deeds, is an ancient motif of Jewish thinking. He traces it back to the prophets and then brings it through the rabbis and through Jewish mysticism and Hasidism. What Art Green has done, which I have offered a friendly amendment to, is characterized how Heschel's translation of Hasidism was itself a bit of a transformation of what Kabbalah and Hasidism had become. Okay, I'm going to say that again, and then we're going to read Art Green. That's the quote on the right. What Art Green did is to explain how Heschel transforms the metaphysics, the theology of Jewish mystics down through the Hasidic masters. Okay, here we go. This is again Art Green talking about Heschel. But the boundaries of good deeds are expanded beyond limitation. Heschel has subtly turned around the order of priorities. Yes, the mitzvot are indeed a divine need. God needs the mitzvot. But it's in the first, but it's in the first case that these commandments deal with a life of goodness and justice. That's what God needs from us, a life of goodness and justice. In doing this, of course, Heschel is restoring the link between the Hasidic masters he knew and the prophets of ancient Israel. Heschel sought to rescue the notion of mitzvot tzrichot, of mitzvot serving a divine need, from the obscurantism of the mystics. In other words, from a primary focus on prayer and ritual mitzvot, which is what the mystics and Hasidic masters had concentrated this idea within, had imprisoned this idea within. Heschel sought to rescue the notion of mitzvot serving a divine need from the obscurantism of the mystics and to bring it back to what he believed was its first source, the teachings of the prophets of Israel, the emphasis on righteousness, justice, and compassion. All right. Knowledge of God is knowledge of living with God. We can't know anything about God unless we bring God into this world through our acts of love. God is alive and in need of love, and we have to love in order to know. This, my friends, and with this, I will turn to the last slide and then open things up. This is turning Maimonides on his head. Maimonides said you have to know in order to love, and Heschel says you have to love in order to know. And so what I've done here, and I'll leave this up as we take questions, or you can tee up a couple of questions for me if you'd like, is a chart that shows you the progress and the distinctions between rabbinic theology, the medieval philosophy of Rambam, his theology, and then Kaplan and Heschel. And I'll have the same chart when we finish Art Green next week. Okay. So happy to take some questions or comments.
Thank you. Theology Thursday is live and well. I'm taking people's comments. Feel free to keep commenting. I'm told in order to comment, they have to click on your image, I guess, and that will bring up the chat, allow people to chat, not their image. Okay. So you did not talk about Israel and Heschel. And what was his relationship to Israel, given that many, certainly Haredi groups who are into mysticism, were not supportive of Israel because they wanted to wait for the Messiah to come before Israel could reconstitute itself? Where did Heschel fall?
So great question. So Heschel did write a book called Jerusalem, an Echo of Eternity. He wrote that book after his first trip to Israel, after the 67 war. Heschel was supportive of the state of Israel. Heschel was a political liberal, and he was very supportive of the state of Israel, but he wanted to emphasize the fact that holiness in Judaism is first of all found in people. Second of all, holiness is found in time, like Shabbat. And third, right, holiness is found in real estate when holy things are done on it. In other words, holiness is intrinsic to human beings and time. Holiness is ascribed to real estate. There is nothing intrinsically holy about the land of Israel unless people are doing holy things in that land. So he was. Does that answer your question, or should I say a little more?
That starts to answer the question. So he wasn't against, for example, the establishment of Israel. He was
No,
Zionist.
he was very much for the establishment of the state as a refuge for Jews from Europe.
So the second question is, how did Heschel deal with the Holocaust, the Shoah, then, in his writings?
Yeah. So the one place, I guess there's two places where Heschel deals with the Shoah. The first is called The Earth is the Lord's, which is a wonderful little book about shtetl life and about the beauty of what was lost. Um, the other book is called A Passion for Truth. And A Passion for Truth was published posthumously. And it's a comparison of the Baal Shem Tov and the theology of joy that the Baal Shem Tov offered, and the Kutzker Rebbe and his theology of realism. And so, as I've said, I think I wrote here under evil, right? So evil is always mixed with divine goodness for Heschel. There is no such thing as an evil that doesn't have an aspect of holiness, right? He gets that from Lurianic Kabbalah. Um, Human beings are responsible for the evil they commit as a result of other human beings allowing that kind of evil to perpetuate. So he doesn't have a novel concept of why evil happens or why the Shoah happens. He wants there to be a novel response to the unprecedented scope and degree of the Holocaust by making sure two things: that there is a state, a sovereign state that has military capability to defend itself for Jews, to provide a haven, and he wants to spread the liberal ideas of tolerance and democracy in the countries that he has influence over, so that Jews will not be subject to illiberal anti-Semitism.
Thank you. There are a few questions now to talk about Heschel's life at JTS. So the first question is his relationship with Mordecai Kaplan and the other professors there and how they interacted given their very different theologies. And the second question is, where did he pray when he was in the United States, New York? Did he pray in a Hasidic synagogue, or did he pray, where did he fit in there?
Yeah. So I don't remember all the places he prayed. I remember that when he was visiting his surviving cousins in Borough Park, he felt very comfortable, right? Because that's not where he was davening in Manhattan. I think he davened quite a bit at JTS's own Beit Midrash. But in terms of his relationship with the other members of the faculty at JTS, he didn't have a lot of friends. And there wasn't a lot of appreciation for what he did. He was not a professor of Hasidism or Jewish mysticism. That was really not recognized by the Talmudic centric faculty. And the line is when Professor Lieberman was introducing Gershom Scholem to give a lecture to the students, was that and this is what he actually said when he was introduced, what Lieberman said when he was introducing Scholem, and it tells you quite a bit. He said, Kabbalah is Narishkeit, but the study of Narishkeit is science, right? So Narishkeit is juvenile, silly, foolish stuff. The Talmudists, Lieberman and the other names who I'm forgetting at the moment, they had relatively little appreciation for what Kabbalah and Hasidism had to add to the Jewish conversation. And I think, and certainly Mordecai Kaplan was not particularly knowledgeable nor particularly respectful of the world of Kabbalah and Hasidism. And so he led a relatively lonely life in terms of his academic colleagues at JTS. All the more so, right, for the first 5 years he was at HUC in Cincinnati. HUC was responsible for getting a visa to Heschel to get out of Warsaw on the eve of the war. He was actually kicked out of Germany in the same purge that kicked out other Jewish non-German citizens that led to Kristallnacht. So right in that kind of late October, early November 1938 expulsion or deportation of non-German Jews. Um, Heschel came back to Warsaw for a few months before he could leave to go to HUC with a quick stop seeing his brother in England.
And I'll share in the follow-up the handout for today and more information about Heschel and his life. Before we end, I guess one or two last questions. One is, um, you know, people have texted me here that they've tried to read Heschel, and you obviously read Heschel, and it's very dense and hard to understand, and you've helped us to understand it today. We kind of need a guide. Is that because Heschel was trying to explain very complex ideas from Lurianic Kabbalah, and therefore it is hard to understand, or is it because he was writing in his fifth language that we're reading in? Um, or it's just his style? Because it's a very challenging style. You cannot just sit down and read a book by Heschel in an
Yeah,
hour or 2 hours, right? It's like page
right.
by page.
Yeah, and so he uses these subtitles quite a bit so that people can have like little bite-sized chunks. So whoever asked that question, you're not the first person to ask that question. Um, Ed Kaplan is the guy that deals with this the most. He wrote a book called Heschel's Poetics. And his theory, so Ed Kaplan, I took a readings course at Brandeis with Ed Kaplan. Um, his theory is that Heschel very much felt the need to take on Buber and Kant and Kaplan and Rosenzweig and the rest of the people who were engaging in different articulations of Judaism that Heschel had a problem with. But he didn't do it in a straight on way. He wanted to evoke through his poetry, through his kind of contrasts, the way he says it's not this, it's this. Like, for instance, he says, all humans have in this world is time. And so when you kill time, you commit murder, right? He's got these great lines. The Bible is not um, human theology, it's divine anthropology. It's not about how humans come to learn about God, it's about how God comes to learn about humans. So Kaplan's claim, and I have no reason to argue, is that the way that Heschel wrote was elusive to draw people in to being more vulnerable or more receptive, depending on your take, to begin to appreciate and accept this awe and wonder and sublime quality of the world, to increase the likelihood that people are going to come away from his book with a receptivity toward faith in God. I mean, it's a pretty tall order, right? How many people can say that they're trying to convince people of God's presence and God's reality? But I think that is what Heschel is doing, which makes his project one of poetic rhetoric rather than um, kind of rational prose that is supposed to work and read like Greek philosophy, A, B, C, D, therefore E. Um, Heschel writes about him. I write about him. Shai Held writes about him. Ed Kaplan writes about him. Sam Dresner writes about him. So there's lots of folks who are trying to systematize what Heschel did in full recognition that Heschel is not a systematic writer of his own theology. When he's doing academic work, he's pretty easy to understand, but that's really not what we're reading in this session, and that's not what people talk about being so difficult to understand about Heschel.
Thank you. So let's wrap up with a promo for next week. Where are we going next week?
All right. So Art Green, my PhD advisor, is, in my estimation, the leading Jewish theologian of the late 20th, early 21st century, for sure in English. He's born in America. he doesn't feel the need to look over his right shoulder to make sure that folks who are more traditionally religious are not going to be upset. So he, similar to Heschel, very much brings a mystical understanding to his articulation of God, and unlike Heschel, is not afraid to undermine the authority of halakhah in the process.
Okay. So everybody, thank you for joining us today. The program, I'll use the word, was sublime. There you go, Shai.
Great.
And people enjoy watching it again, I think, and getting your materials. And I will follow up with another email. Looking forward to having you back. And you have to come visit us in Orange County. You can't just send your child here and not visit. This is your hometown.
All right,
So
I'll let you know
hope
when I'm coming out.
you come out.
Okay.
We'll host you for an event for our locals.
Yes,
Thanks
sir.
everybody. Wishing you all Shabbat Shalom for this coming weekend. Take care, be safe, enjoy the summer. It's almost over. Bye guys.
Thank you.